want to start?
Go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
Actually, we still have 1 minute. Maybe it's possible that we turn off the air conditioning.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So let's get going. So welcome to the first session of Oauth. Let's start. So this is the note well. Everything that you say and contribute is governed by this note well. So make sure to read it and understand the implication of this note well. I think we have a Jabber scribe as Roman, and thank you, Roman. Roman obviously is our new AD, so welcome, and thanks for Eker for being a chair for some time. The AD, sorry. Minute taker. Tony. Oh, thanks, Tony. And blue sheets are going around here. So let's. Okay, so let's give an update on some of those drafts. I think the browser-based apps will be discussed on Thursday. The device flow, I think it's waiting for an update from William. I don't know the latest. Like, did you see?
So so I think that's the draft update has been submitted, so that's fine. I think it's waiting for the AD to follow up.
Yeah, William submitted it. Did it? Okay. Okay. So it's with Eker, I guess.
That's the device flow.
Distributed Oauth, I don't think there was no update recently on this one, and incremental Oauth 2. Right?
Yeah, it was Dick, who is the main author. She recently changed job, so we'll have to, and unfortunately he wasn't able to come to this meeting, so we'll have to find out whether there's someone who can support him with this work, and which originally started by Amazon, so we'll have to figure this out.
But you don't know if he's saying I'm not going to continue that, right? He didn't say anything, right?
He didn't say anything.
Yeah, so let's wait for him, right? The job request, I think it's wait. Go ahead, Johan.
We had a session on it at the security workshop last week, so we resolved a bit of the language, but now that we have the server metadata done, there was a request for, now that we actually have a place to register server metadata parameters, there was a consensus or a sense in the room that some of the parameters, we should add an IANA consideration section and register a couple of extra parameters that would make it easier for people to use it. So there will be an update shortly.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paging and device flow. Is William here?
No.
Okay. So my memory was that William and I sat down together and went through this document. Is that other people's memory? So, and it's good. Okay. So the new document that I have in front of me is the resolution to that.
Yes.
Good. Then I'll just push it forward.
Okay.
Right. I think the only thing new from that is there was a change of name to have it make more sense, but that's not really normative.
Yeah.
And the char, so what's the timeline for that one? Because it's now going to update it this week or so?
Yeah.
So because that would be obviously a good time to get this out of the door, because it has been in
Right.
like in the IHG.
So I'll try and
forever.
get that in, and hopefully it won't push it back into the IESG process. Just adding some IANA registrations. We'll probably have to redo the IANA call again, but that shouldn't be a big deal.
And then the job BCP. So I think it's with the Ecker. Like, is that?
Go to the mic.
JOT BCP completed IESG review. We addressed all the area director feedback.
Yeah, I think so.
I believe Ecker just needs to push the button once he's satisfied that I'm correct, that it should go to the RFC editor.
And I think you have enough kind of votes to go.
Yeah, we have
forward with
enough
it.
votes for
Yeah.
it to pass.
Yes. It's
And that's true. It's not. No, it's AD evaluation, so it's
So-
not in the IHG.
Oh, okay.
I think so. So my notes on the state say I'm waiting for some changes for a new draft. Hold on, give my email.
I believe.
Do you want to go to the microphone?
I believe I made the changes and emailed you, but I'll find that and resend it.
No, your email says you're going to publish it by. Maybe I just didn't get back to you on this. Okay, I think I see what happened. I think what happened is that you sent me some of these proposed changes, and I just didn't tell you they were okay. Let me read them now, and if they're okay, I'll tell you, and you can chop about it.
Very good.
okay. Good. So, JOT introspection response that will be discussed today. MTLS will be discussed on Thursday. POP will be discussed on Thursday. Reciprocal, this is again Dick's document. Resource indicator, this was submitted to the IETF, to the ISG just recently, like, few days ago, 3 weeks ago, right? So we're good there. Security topics is going to be discussed later today. And a token binding. So this is, I don't think,
There was no.
members, no update recently.
So for the token exchange, so Brian said that his priority is on the token exchange and not so much on updating the token binding at the moment. So hopefully we'll get a new version of the token exchange submitted, so to address some of the comments. That's the status.
It looked to me like there was a lot of back and forth with the ADs who had discussions on token exchange. So Brian thinks that like they're not responding fast enough. Roman and I are happy to chase them, but I typically let the discussion happen on its own. So let me know. Let me know how you want me to proceed, or else proceed. We'll do some chasing or corralling people as necessary.
Yeah, we talked to Brian last week. He was very busy with some other work, and so that's why it dropped a little bit on his to-do list.
Okay, so our agenda, again, we've talked about the chair's updates, so security topics and JOT introspection that Torsten, then Eve remotely will be talking about UMA draft, and the last one would be Vittorio talking about that JOT usage in access tokens.
Yes, I also wanted to point out that we are holding these conference calls every second week to discuss working group matters. And if you guys want something moving along, or if there's some questions, just dial in. We stay there for half an hour and chat with you about the ongoing topics. So just to make sure that we are not letting anything fall between the cracks. I send it to the mailing list.
Yeah.
The meeting invite.
Okay. Okay, I guess Torsten, want to keep going? Oh, sorry. Well, the second one is okay.
Yeah.
Hold on.
No.
You have it?
That can't be true. Like, here's the data tracker. Security topics first?
Yeah.
And then, which, for full screen, push here.
And there is another thing here.
Okay. The other one? This one? No. This one?
Something. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Torsten Oderstedt. I'm with yes.com, and I'm going to give you an update on the work on the security best current practice for Oauth 2. The security BCP aims to update the security threat model, the original OAuth 2.0 security threat model, and the security consideration sections given in the core RFC and the Burrow token RFC to cope with more current challenges stemming from advanced use cases such as open banking and so on, which elevate the need for or elevate the security requirements which OAuth has to cope with. And we also have learned from deployments in the last couple of years, and that's why we decided to write down this BCP. It will update or updates the threat model and describes newly discovered attacks along with mitigations, where we also use newer technologies and mechanisms such as MTLS, token binding, and so on. So we nicely weave them into our recommendations. And our goal is to give implementers simple and actionable recommendations how they can securely implement OAuth applications. So what has happened since Bangkok? Oh, a lot has happened. We published 4 revisions, 9 to 12, and the most significant change, and we already had talked about that in Bangkok, the working group came to the consensus to discourage use of the implicit grant and grants with similar properties, meaning grants that issue access tokens in the authorization response. I just pasted the statement from the BCP here. So this means the implicit grant as well as some of the OIDC grants are no longer recommended by this working group. Anyone is free to use them or to continue to use them, but our recommendation is to drop them and to replace them by using authorization code plus PXE. And in my observation, and last week we had a very, very good OAuth security workshop, adoption of this has already been started. So, for example, the financial grade API working group with the OpenID Foundation recently removed the code token ID token from the Part 2 spec, and also learned that already JavaScript libraries are starting to support code plus PXE. And there are some more changes. In the course of the discussion around this call for consensus on the working group, a lot of additional topics came up. For example, by developers of SPAs, they ask, how are we supposed to work with refresh tokens, for example? And that's why we decided to add some more text around the use of refresh tokens to the BCP, along with text on how replay detection can be achieved for refresh tokens. And obviously, there is sender constraining, there is, or one can bind the refresh token to a client ID and authenticate the client. But in scenario where both of those mechanisms are not available, for example, in the JavaScript application running in the browser, then you could potentially use a mechanism we call refresh token rotation. It just uses the fact that the refresh token is issued with every refresh to, in the end, detect whether someone utilized the refresh token of an older generation, and then just revokes all the access to active tokens. So we added some text around that topic. And what we also did is realized, thanks to Daniel, we were working on the different working assumptions than for the original threat model, meaning the attacker model has changed. And that was one of the main reasons why we started to work on .pcp. Because when Oauth was initially published, the setup was quite simple. There was one client, one AS, and a fixed set of resource servers. So a rather static setup where the client could be configured at runtime with some URLs and then could use TLS server authentication to make sure it's talking to the right guy. This has changed completely. Now we are facing dynamic scenarios where an attacker could potentially also set up a fake RS on an AS and steal tokens. So we already considered that in our threat analysis, but we never had documented the new attack model or the enhanced attack model, and we did that now. So if you take a look on the latest version of the BCP, section 2, there is the enhanced attack model. And what we also did, and this is nothing specific to the content, but just to let you know, we moved from XML to RFC towards Markdown for actually writing the RFC or the BCP, and it proved to be quite useful. So if you want to know how this is going to work and what problems we were facing and how we circumvented them, just drop Daniel or me. I think it's better to drop Daniel an email about that. Okay. Are we done yet? We don't think so, because there are some open topics we would like to bring to your attention. First of all, during the security workshop last week, the Oauth security workshop, I think Ned raised the question, and in the end, it was an obvious question. How shall we proceed with the resource owner password credentials grant type? And I think the consensus in the room quickly was, let's deprecate it. Because it was already seen as a legacy in RFC 6749. I would like to get your opinion on that topic later on. And I think we should also post that, all those topics potentially to the list to get an opinion by the working group. Next topic that we didn't really address yet, although we recommend sender-constrained access tokens, and that typically includes some kind of public key cryptography, either MTLS or some application level stuff. The BCP doesn't talk about client authentication yet. Does it mean that we like client secrets? Tony, where are you? Do you like client secrets? Yeah, okay, great. So our proposal is to add a recommendation to the draft for implementers to move towards public key-based crypto for client authentication for obvious reasons. Tony, do you want to say something? Okay, you smile. That's great. Yeah, that's one other topic we would like to include. And third, since we now made Pixie a mandatory feature of all web-based flow in Oauth for the purpose of replay detection, we could also just recommend its use for CSRF prevention, because it basically works along the same lines as state. It's a one-time use nonce with even better protection. And Daniel also after having talked to the Stuttgart researchers that did the formal analysis of Oauth, came back and said we should get rid of that, meaning that the state parameter would be freed again for application purposes. So we just go for PXE as the mechanism for tying OAuth authorization sessions to a certain user agent and to detect replay. We no longer need to recommend state to be used for CSRF protection. And the last one is the PXE mode. We don't talk right now about the PXE mode. And what we propose is to go with SHA-256 because it has better properties, since the code challenge can't be used as a verifier. So if an attacker gets hold of a code challenge in the authorization request, and that's part of our new attack model, it can be used to in the end, complete a transaction. So those are the 3 proposed changes. And if you've got an opinion, we'd be really appreciate to hear them.
Tony Nadlin. So are you just going to propose, as far as the password is concerned, are you just proposing totally deprecating this? I mean, it is used like a heck of a lot out there today. I mean, that's where people started from, and it's an easy way to, to do things. So I'm just, I understand the desire to not promote it, but I worry about, the implementations that are out there today.
Yeah, I agree. And at Deutsche Telekom, we use it all over the place.
So I think
after we had started with the code flow,
right.
We went to the resource owner password, and then we went back to code because we wanted to introduce federated identity and two-factor authentication. So there are not only security reasons for no longer recommending it. First of all, as you said, well, that's what I heard. If we recommend that, then it's called kind of a blessing for people to do it. So I've met developers that when I told them, oh, it's really risky what you do because all of your applications are gonna handle credentials. Yeah, sure. But you can find that grant type in RFC 6749, so it must be okay. Yeah. And no one really reads the security considerations.
We at least
sadly.
We at least have to have an answer. I mean, an alternative for. What do you suggest we give them as an alternative?
Do you really want me to answer that question?
I know.
I mean, in the end, there is also always the way for an implementation to use custom grant types to do this kind of shit.
So proxying from Jabber, Justin Richards says +1 to everything that's here. The recommendations are sound.
Thank you, Justin.
Hi, it's Pamela. So what about the use case where the client is not using PXE and you've deprecated state? What happens there?
Since we deprecated implicit and made PXE mandatory in combination with code, what grant type might that be? Okay,
so but does PXE itself not allow identity providers to have clients of either side? Like, isn't there changes that have to happen to the PXE spec as well?
No, we use PXE as it is, just as a nonce to tie the session to a certain user agent. The only difference is that now we are no longer limiting PXE to public clients. We also recommend the use of PXE with confidential clients because it addresses a different need. The need is not to authenticate the client, but to authenticate the originator of a certain transaction.
So just to clear, John Bradley, so a clarification, we're not proposing deprecating state. We're proposing no longer using requiring state be used for CSRF because 90% of the implementations who are using state don't properly use it for CSRF. And since PXE provides the CSRF protection, we can say you can just use state for state don't worry about using it for CSRF because you're probably not going to do it right anyways.
For application state, you mean?
Yeah, which is, it was kind of a dual purpose thing. Here, put your application state here and put enough entropy and other things to bind the request to the browser so that you can detect CSRF, but we're not going to tell you how. So as a result, not so many people got it right. They used state values like 1, 2, 3, 4 because an attacker would never guess that. So we suspect that using Pixie for CSRF protection is actually going to be more effective than the current use of state for that, which then makes it easier for developers. But we're not saying you can't use state for CSRF if you want. If you're not using Pixie for some reason, you still need to use state for that.
So Mike Jones, Microsoft. I don't know if you have more slides to go through.
I have one more slide.
Okay, because at some point soon, I want to ask some questions about the state of the implicit grant and what our next steps are. But if you have more to do, I'll just put a placeholder. Stop, John. I'll just put a placeholder in and ask it when you're done.
Yep.
Proxy again from Jabber. Philip Hunt says, back to what Justin was saying, I agree. I too run into issues of developers justifying bad practices because of the RFC. So agreed.
Thank you. So that's my last slide for this presentation. We are facing some more challenges than we were able to cope with the BCP right now. So, and one of them is that we as a community need to provide developers that develop SPAs with a clear guidance on how to implement those SPAs correctly, which is really a difficult task, as we learned last week. We've got a BCP underway for that specific topic. So I just wanted to point out to people in the room there is another SPA BCP being worked on by David Wade and help me, Aaron, yeah, to describe how SPAs should be implemented on top of Oauth.
Dustin, for the new people, you should say what SPA is.
Oh. What does it stand for? Thank you very much. Single page application. So basically all kinds of applications running in a user agent. And they have different properties and can, for example, not use or properly or simply use mutual TLS for sender constraining as we recommend it to be used for other kinds of apps. So we have to find our way either by proposing completely different architectures where all the OAuth stuff is put into a backend where all those other mechanisms can be used again. Or, and that's the second bullet, we come up with a mechanism for sender constraining that can be used in SPAs. And we just recently discussed at the OAuth security workshop a mechanism. John Bradley proposed something, and we're gonna do a write-up, and we hope to have something we can present on Thursday. And there are two other aspects. I just wanna bring that up here for your information. There is some work in the financial grade API working group at the OpenID Foundation that is dedicated to really high security use cases, where we are working on protecting what I call rich authorization requests. So authorization requests carrying a lot of authorization data, such as lists of accounts, lists of documents to be signed, and so on, that needs to be protected against modification, and also using signatures for protecting authorization responses. That's not work being done in the OAuth working group, but in I would say in the close neighborhood. I'm done. Mike, do you want to?
Sure. So Mike Jones, Microsoft. I'm going to challenge, excuse me. I'm going to challenge you made a statement you made fairly quickly early in your presentation, where you said there was working groups consensus to deprecate the implicit flow. There was a vote in Thailand without much prior discussion about in the room, should we do that? But I just looked on the list, and to my knowledge, there'd never been a working group consensus call on that topic. Indeed, what happened on the list after you made your blog post, which you're welcome to do, right? There was a lot of people saying that the reality is more complicated than a black-white choice, and we should be describing the security trade-offs of preventing token injection attacks, of preventing token theft, and giving people as much actionable information as we could. So I guess my request is, if we're going to actually deprecate that, there should actually be a working group consensus call to do so. But there's other alternatives, like instead describe how you mitigate those problems rather than just saying you can't use it. In fact, there's ways to use it safely. And I'm not one to stand in the way of progress, as you know, but at the same time, this whole discussion has generated an awful lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I think it's made this situation in the Oauth developer community much more confused. I know I see that at Microsoft.
So first of all, as you may know, when you've read the BCP gives advice. So it discourages use of those flows, and it also gives advice what to do. And we also have a BCP that gives advice on that. And exactly this text that I have shown you was the result of a working group consensus. There's a thread on the mailing list. You can look it up. It has 120 messages. 120 messages.
I know.
And there were just 2 people objecting against that consensus, and roughly 20 people voting in favor of that.
There wasn't a consensus call. There wasn't an ask
it
for a vote.
It was a call.
If you guys could not talk over each other, please.
Okay.
Back and forth, please. Yeah.
Okay. It was a consensus call about exactly that text.
My read is it didn't say consensus call anywhere in the thread. Hannes?
Yeah, we can look it up. But I saw it as a consensus call on the text. But we can have a look at it, and I will do that right now. But I thought it was understood as such. There's probably not the word consensus call in the subject heading. But I will quickly.
So maybe a question. So here we're saying should not or recommend. So you're not saying we're deprecating that and you must not use the existing implicit, right?
That's diplomacy. I'm not a diplomat.
Okay.
So we turned around over, and the overnet recommended to make it a must not. I leaned in favor of a should not, because basically what I want to achieve is to get a movement rolling, right? Okay. So in the end, anybody out there can do implicit as long as they want. But I don't want to give them the blessing that we as a working group recommend this kind of stuff. If you take a look into RFC 6749 security considerations section, it explicitly states that the implicit grant is vulnerable to injection attacks. I don't know exactly why we ever made that part of OAuth. Seriously speaking, the only reason I know of is at the time when we published OAuth, CORS didn't exist. That's the only rationale. And since this is no longer a problem, we can go ahead and can use code, which in the end simplifies OAuth as a whole.
So I'm asking this because typically people, when they read should not, they would say, well, it's not that it's complete.
Do you want me to make it a must not?
No.
I can tell you what my observation is. My observation is people have blamed me for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But basically what happened is the community started to move in the direction we recommend them to move. As I said, there are already the people that blamed me on Twitter started to migrate their JavaScript library to support our recommendations. And I mean, what can we hope for?
Yeah.
Do you want me to send you the pointer?
It's difficult to find. It doesn't. Sorry about this. It was a long discussion. Well, I will post it to the list, but you can see my original text here, and the headline said recommended authorization code instead of implicit OAuth security topics, and provide the sort of initial email here. But of course, there were lots of follow-up emails, and then I concluded the whole thing. We went through the feedback afterwards. So I thought that it was a pretty good discussion and a judgment. I may have been more, I probably could have been more clear in the subject header of the email in saying that's a consensus call. We'll do that in the future to make it more clear. But that was essentially, we came to the text that I had previously shown on the screen. That was sort of the conclusion. It was initially a must.
Hannes. You send a posting with this text and ask people for consensus. So this was in a later posting. So my suggestion is, let's sit together over the meeting and we will find this thread, right?
I have it on this.
So because we also had a virtual meeting about that,
I posted on this.
I'm quite sure that most people perceive that as a consensus call, including me.
Okay, my perception is we just had a rollicking discussion.
Yep.
But I'm willing to be wrong on this, but I didn't think there was any consensus, that we just had a lot of discussion.
Let's check that. Okay, can you please open the other slide deck?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Let's. I would still like to hear what the folks in the room think about the previous.
Can you go back?
How far?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. So to hear what sort of the impression of the room is. So I'll just go through one by one to see what the views are. So who in the room is in favor of discouraging the use of the resource owner password credentials grant? Raise your hand. And who's against it? Who thinks that we shouldn't discourage the use of it? So I would say that people are in favor of discouraging this. Of course, we'll confirm it on a mailing list. Who in the room recommends? Do you have someone from on the first item?
No, I'm late on the sequencing. Philip Hunt says, I recall in Singapore there was an agreement to produce a die spec for implicit.
Okay, I don't recall that one, but okay. There's who is in favor of recommending client authentication methods based on public key crypto? Raise your hand. So we again up at 2, 4, 6.
So I have 2 in Jabber in favor of discouraging.
The previous one. So
Yes.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sorry, the Jabber is.
It's a little slow.
real time.
Yeah. Okay. So who's against making any recommendations on the client authentication methods based on public key crypto? Well, the details. No, that's not
the second one.
client authentication. Yeah. Client auth. In the client ID, client secret. Okay, I don't.
Oh, you're on bullet 2 now.
Yes.
That's true.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I don't hear anyone. So at least.
So the folks on Jabber are saying, can you please restate the call? They're having trouble following.
Okay, sorry. So I repeat the second one again. So who is in favor of making a recommendation on client authentication methods based on public key crypto? Raise your hand again. So we have 2, 4, 6.
John is for.
Well, I count you only once, even if you raise both hands. Okay. Any objection?
Before we do that, in favor of crypto is 1.
Okay. Are you writing this down?
Oh, the numbers?
No, roughly. Okay, cool. Thanks, Tony. Okay. The next one. Who is in favor of using Pixie for CSRF protection instead of the state parameter? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 in a room.
And a Jabber, 1 coming in, 2 coming in favor of Pixie.
Okay, so 8.
3 in favor.
9.
Pixie is a sub-party.
Yeah. So who's against this recommendation? Nobody. And finally, who is in favor of recommending the Pixie mode SHA-256 instead of the plain mode? Raise your hand. It's a kind of that's an easier.
I have 2 on Jabber.
Okay. So and who's against it? Who would like to stick with the plain mode as a recommendation? Nobody.
I don't think anybody actually uses plain anymore. It's just
Well, but I still want to ask because I think it's fair. It's an easier one than others, but okay. So I think that was pretty clear that people want to follow the recommendations you put on that slide for the next version of the document. But we'll still do a consensus call on the mailing list to make sure that we also catch those who are neither on the online nor in the room.
Okay. You will send consensus calls or
Yeah.
postings around that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Next slide. It's a little bit annoying. You have to scroll down here. This one?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So next topics, I would like to give you an update on a draft that I've written together with Vladimir Chuvinov. It's about JOT-protected responses from the introspection endpoint. So what it basically does is it enhances RFC 7662 by the ability to not only respond with a JSON response from the token introspection endpoint, but make it a JOT, which then allows for signing, especially signing the introspection response. The use case that we have in mind for this kind of functionality are high assurance use cases where the recipient of the data, the resource server, needs to take the AS some kind of liability regarding the content of this introspection response. Basically, some auditing and non-repudiation requirements that we see in open banking and also in the electronic signing sphere. And the problem is in those use cases, you not necessarily can use JOTs as access tokens, which would provide you with this kind of non-repudiation via digital signatures, because you use the access token to interact with different resource servers. And in those situations, introspection much better fits. And adopting this draft will more or less give us a balance between the different design alternatives, using signed JOT tokens and using introspections for high assurance use cases. The draft was adopted, I think, mid last year as a working group item, and we haven't had much changes since Bangkok. Basically, we updated some references, for example, for the server metadata, but the draft is here. It's a rather small draft, a rather simple draft. It's being implemented, it's being used, but not many changes. There's one open issue with that draft, and I would like to bring that to your attention. I would like to get your advice on that. Justin suggested to change the draft into a more general mechanism to enable judge responses at any kind of OAuth endpoint, meaning introspection, registration, revocation, and so on. I brought that question up at the last meeting and also posted to the mailing list exactly that question. And there were exactly 2 postings reacting on my question, and exactly both in completely different directions. So Mike just said, let's do one thing well. And Justin revoiced his support or its proposal to make it a more generic mechanism. I try to keep neutral on that point, but my objective is to get it through, because we have deployments depending on that draft, and I think it's a useful extension. I would like to get your advice as a working group and you as working group chairs how to proceed with that topic.
Any opinions beside? I think Mike will state his opinion, but we want more.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I just want to reiterate, I think unless there's clear use cases for more, less is more.
I'm Mark. I'm just thinking there are use cases for returning a jot from the introspection endpoint, but returning a jot from discovery or registration, I think it's been solved already in a standardized way, isn't it? Like that you have assigned metadata document as a jot as part of the discovery response. So if you were to add that, then you would have to change that as well, those specs as well. I don't know if that's worth it, to be honest.
Tony Nadlin, I would say let's keep it simple and get it done and out the door. I think it solves the use case, at least for things that we have going on in FAPI and stuff that we need to worry about right now.
Yeah.
I would not like to see it drag out for another year and we don't get something out the door. That's my concern.
Okay. So I think when the document was accepted, it was with a specific scope, right? So
Justin already pointed out at that time that he would propose to make it a more generic mechanism.
I see.
So
okay.
It's kind of a conditional acceptance, at least from his side.
So from Jabber, Justin says, well, that's my point. We're doing a point solution in parallel, and shouldn't we just do one thing everywhere? I think the end state might be the same thing anyway. And then prior to that, Brian said, in my opinion, given where things are right now, I think keeping this document to be introspection only in scope is the right thing to do. So it looks like Brian and Justin are saying the same.
Okay. So maybe just run for a hard.
Yeah.
Okay. John has a.
So while I do have some sympathy for Justin's position, the reality is that we have MIME content type negotiation. JOTs have a MIME type. There is a clear way to ask for different MIME types that people already have for other specs. The difference, I think, is all of the trust stuff around. It's not just asking for a JOT, it's how do you define all of the trust relationships. And I think if we start pulling those other trust relationships into this spec, we're not going to finish. So yes, it would be nice in principle to have the same way to do it, and other specs can do it in a similar way, but they're probably going to have to define their own trust relationships. So I think other specs having some sort of profile to say how they do it is going to be required anyways. Yes, they can follow this pattern. So I would come down on the side of keeping this, not dragging those other things into the spec and just getting it done.
Do you want to go for then? Okay, so we would like to get the sense of the meeting. So in the room here, so call for a hum and see if what the work group is leaning towards. So the question is, we want to ask if you want to keep this scope as it is, and the other one is to extend that scope. So hum now if you're in support of keeping the scope of the document as is. Okay. Hum now if you're in favor of extending the scope of this document. Okay. None. Okay.
There was a little bit.
Oh, I didn't. Anything. Okay. From here. Okay. 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 I think. Yeah, I think we'll stick with this document. Okay.
Okay.
So then, from my perspective, it's done.
Okay.
So what are the next steps?
Well,
Working. Yeah.
No. Well, so maybe we call for reviews just to make sure. Okay.
Sure. But
Okay.
I think we'll obviously confirm that on a mailing list, but I think we if the mailing list also, or the folks on the list also agree with that, then we'll start a working group last call on that document, I think. Okay. Because we end of the pipe here. Good. Mm. I think she has to. I think if you have to join the queue as a speaker or so, and then we can accept it and you can start your presentation. I think that's the way it is.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So Mache and I are both presenting, so we'll be going back and forth. Mache, you'll probably want to turn on your microphone if you haven't. We've got a lot of material. We're going to be just doing some highlights and sort of treating the slides as a leave behind. In addition to Mache and myself, we're both presenting remotely. There's a couple of other relevant folks in the room. Pedro, can you just identify yourself if you're there and say hello to everybody? So Pedro is an UMA implementer from Keycloak, from Red Hat, and also Ishara, are you there as well? Could you say hello? From WSO2, another implementer, and they are willing to have some sort of evening discussion if people want to get together later, have additional questions, maybe over a beer, so you can figure that out yourselves later on. Maybe Mache and I can just have a beer ourselves at home in honor. So next slide, please. So we're just going to cover a bunch of topics pretty quickly. Those last two topics before the conclusion are just if we have time. I've got a timer set here so that we'll keep an eye on things. We do want to get to the conclusion and next steps most importantly, so I'll keep an eye on that. We're going to take a progressive disclosure approach, so we'll hit a few topics several times, knowing that user-managed access is kind of, even though it's based on OAuth, it's kind of a newish thing. So we'll hit a few things sort of several times in expanding fashion. So next slide, please. Machi, I'll take this overview section.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Right. So we all know Oauth, right? It enables constraint delegation. So it's I would say pretty straightforward from a high level perspective. We have a resource owner, a client that interacts with a resource server at the authorization server, and you can see in here we have these we have that kind of a collocation of the authorization server and the resource server. If we can go to the next slide. And UMA differs in, I would say, two main points. The first thing is that it does enable a cross-party sharing. So, firstly, the sharing of a resource, of a protected resource, does not happen to just a different application, to a different client, but it happens to a different party. So we have a concept of a resource owner, but we also have a concept of a requesting party which can be different from the resource owner. So we have that notion of a cross-party sharing, and we also have a notion of a wide ecosystem. So if you take a look at the bottom of the diagram, you see that there's no dotted kind of line between the authorization server and the resource servers. It means that those resource server can realistically reside in different domains. They can be kind of managed by different organizations and still talk to the same single authorization server. And that is achieved through introduction of a number of different, I would say, concepts, but also endpoints. In the previous diagram, we had the standard endpoint, the authorization and the token endpoint, but in here you see additional resource registration, permission, and enhanced token introspection, and a claims interaction endpoint. If you can go to next slide, please. So an overview of the UMA. So in UMA we have kind of these two specs. The bottom line is the bottom part of the diagram shows the UMA grant for all of authorization. So this is the spec that kind of defines this cross-party sharing. The upper part of the diagram is the federated authorization for UMA, and it discusses how we can make this wide ecosystem, I would say, concept a reality. So a single authorization server, multiple different resource servers. And in UMA, we have these new set of tokens. So you see that we have a protection API token, we have a requesting party token, we have a persisted claims token. We will discuss them on examples and in the flows in the next slides. So next slide, please.
So a little bit of history of how all this came to be. So the work of user-managed access has been done at the Kantara initiative, where people had wanted to sort of empower users to share data. But we have actually had some interaction with IETF over time. Why all these contributions that we've been making? We actually had a goal to sediment some modular pieces into wider communities where appropriate. So we've been assessing over time appetite for broader adoption, and doing this helps promote adoption. So actually the original dynamic client registration spec came from early UMA work, UMA 1.0 work, and Maciej is one of the authors of the ultimate Oauth dynamic client registration spec from this history. All of these that you see here on the screen are expired except for the new UMA 2.0 drafts. And any questions at this point before we move on? Just to check. Okay, I'm not actually, there may be some stuff in the chat that just flag us since we're remote. Okay, great. So now just a couple of sort of one slide on each of these specs to sort of say what you can see in them. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Right. So let's discuss the UMA grant for all of authorization. So I printed the spec, and I think it's best to discuss that on the on the example that we have in the specification. So let me read that and let me relate it to these three concepts that we see on the slide. The first one being party-to-party sharing, the second one being asynchronous, and the third one mentioning policies. So the example that we have in the spec basically says the following. So we have a bank customer, Alice, who has a bank account service, which is the resource server, and she can use a sharing management service, the authorization server, hosted by the bank to manage access to her various protected resources. And she can manage access to her spouse, Bob, an accounting professional, Charlene, or a financial information aggregation company. So all of those kind of parties that can potentially access, they are the requesting parties. So we see that the actual sharing happens not, from Alice to Alice, but from Alice to Bob or different other parties. The second thing is that it's asynchronous. So in the case of Oauth, it's a typical scenario that we would authorize access to a protected resource. In case of UMA, what happens is that Alice would be able to use the authorization server and go and set policies, not at the time the actual access happens. So in respect to the grant, it's not a synchronous interaction. And the second thing are those and the third thing are those policies. So at the authorization server, what Alice does is that she can manage, I would say, various different complex policies for access to protected resources. So it doesn't have to be just authorize or deny. It can be a more complex policy that requires some claims gathering, as we will discuss later, that mentions some conditions, etc., etc. Next slide, please. And to discuss the second spec, so the federated authorization, I'll also use the example from the specification to relate to these again 3 concepts. So 1-to-N interactions, scope grain control, and the resource and scope concepts. So the example is as following. It's pretty much a similar example. We have a bank customer, a resource owner, Alice, who has a bank account service, a resource server, but also a cloud file system, which is a different resource server. And Alice uses a dedicated sharing management service, which is an authorization server hosted by the bank. So she can manage access to both the bank account service and to the cloud service from a single authorization server, and that shows this 1-to-N relationship. Again, she manages access to various different parties, and during the sharing, what she can do is that she can define whether access to a resource is of view type, is of edit type, that can relate to, let's say, files, or in relation to the bank, view financial data, maybe move money, etc., etc. So this scope-grained access control means that we are really able to have various different scopes associated with various different resources, and those resource and scope concepts, they kind of differ in the UMA case. So in the OAuth, it's more of a flat structure that we have. In the UMA case, we have a specific set of resources and scopes associated with these resources. Are there maybe any questions at this point?
I think we're okay.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and a quick reference to tokens. So if you recall the diagram that was presented earlier showing the 2 specs and the kind of the 2 different mechanisms that we have in UMA, then the 3 main tokens that are in the flows that we use. I'll start with the protection API access tokens, with the PAT token. So in the protection API access token, is a token that allows this interaction between the resource server and the authorization server. So between the resource server and the authorization server. The resource server in that interaction acts as a, I would say, plain OAuth client. The token has to have the UMA protection scope associated in it. So it's probably the simplest token to explain. The other two tokens, which are very much UMA specific, is the requesting party token and the persisted claims token. So the RPT, that's the token that represents the permissions when a client tries to access a protected resource on the resource server. So this is the token that has to be in the request that is passed from the client to the resource server. And it has to be associated, it has to have a set of permissions associated for the access to the protected resource to be successful. The persisted claims token, as we'll explain further in during the presentation, is some kind of a correlation handle that allows the authorization server to kind of remember the requesting party that's interacting with that server before an RPT, so the requesting party token, can be issued to the client that is operated by that requesting party.
Okay.
Next slide.
Moving along to a different topic here. So what are people doing with it? Implementation in the wild. Next slide, please.
Just 1 second.
Yeah.
Tony Nadlin, I just have a question on, why have an RPT and PCT token, right? Can't we just wind up using access tokens here?
Yeah, the RPT is literally just an access token, and we gave it a nickname because we had a couple of other things floating around in the environment. So it's literally an access token. It could be called the access token, except that the PAT is also an access token. So we gave them nicknames. That's all it is. Thanks. Thanks for the question. Okay, implementation and use in the wild. Next slide, please. So here's some typical use cases we've been seeing. UMA was originally designed for this Alice to Bob use case. So when you want to be able to have other autonomous third parties who are not Alice wielding clients. And here we see use cases like patient-directed health data and device sharing, financial use cases like this discovering and aggregating pension accounts and sharing access to financial advisors. That's from UK Pensions Dashboard, which is where the UK Department for Work and Pensions has been doing a profile. But we've seen other use cases arise because it tended to be sort of a generative use case once solved. So enterprise to Alice, so enterprise API access management, and access delegation between employees because the initial resource owner is basically the enterprise, as well as an Alice to Alice use case where you want Alice to be able to proactively set policy for which applications get access to her stuff. And you can see on the right where people have been profiling or pointing to UMA. So those are some use cases. And next slide, please. You can see a list of known implementations so far. So as I mentioned, we've got some people in the room who represent some of these implementations, as well as I see some people participating and observing remotely. If you want to ask questions, there may be some people who can also answer through the chat. Okay, so now we're going to change gears a little bit in the next section with basic flows in the UMA grant. So this is the UMA grant spec, which is kind of the major main spec. Abstract sequence for the UMA 2 grant. So we're just going to build on this swim lane as we go here. These are sort of the entities. So getting to the grant, this means we're focusing on the client perspective. The client interacting with AS and the RS. The RO is not in the picture, therefore. We said it's asynchronous, so they may not be around at all. By the way, the UMA clients can be public or confidential, so a little similar to the assertion grant. The client can have learned of the protected resource location in any way. So for example, maybe the requesting party role, the Bob role, might have clicked on an email link or whatever. Next slide, please. Continuing here, so the initial resource request, unlike other OAuth grants, But like some other things we might know of, the client goes to the resource server first. So that's kind of familiar from web access management, or as we're seeing from some ACE work, one of the ACE patterns is client to RS first. So we'll discuss some implications of this in a bit. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into the response to a tokenless resource request for something that turns out to be protected. So we've got a client that is UMA enabled, that's going to know how to respond to what the RS sends it in this response. The RS is going to get what UMA calls a permission ticket from the AS. It's going to send that in a header called ticket. The client's going to have to present that at the AS in the next step. The RS also indicates in this step what AS to go to. So it's going to do some AS discovery. Does this in a header, AS_URI. And based on this, the client is going to be able to go to a discovery doc. We just reused the OAuth discovery doc and add a little bit of extension metadata to it. We missed by a timing thing. We didn't point to the final RFC for that because of a timing skew. Maybe I don't know if we'll have time today or if there will be some discussion time Thursday. I'm going to miss it. It'll be in the middle of my night. But I know that there's some AS discovery stuff going on, and there's been some discussion on the list back in the fall. But I'm just going to suggest that we go to the next slide at this point.
Right. Yeah, so we have this permission, as we saw on the earlier slide, we have this permission ticket that gets returned to the client that's trying to access a protected resource. And the permission ticket is kind of like an authorization code. It's just that it's for the requesting party and the client, and it like binds the client, the resource server, and the authorization server. So it binds that that interaction of those like untrusted entities, and it references the permissions that the client, it references the permissions that the client will eventually obtain. And those are registered by the resource server at the authorization server. So it's important that, like, if the client tries to access a resource and makes, let's say, a GET request that to a photo, to a single photo, then the permissions that get registered and that are reflected by the permission ticket can be just a read scope for that particular photo, or it can be, let's say, a read for the photo and the entire album, or some additional scopes that the RS thinks and decides that it should apply. Okay, next slide, please. Right, and now we'd like to discuss the basically the way that we exchange, the way we actually obtain the, or the way we enter the entire, I would say, UMA flow, so like an abstract a sequence for the main UMA grant. And there are like two ways that we can enter. The first one is by so when the client obtains the permission ticket, it can decide to push the claims directly to the authorization server, or it can decide that it will redirect the requesting party for a more of an interactive claims gathering flow. So the first one was a back channel interaction without the involvement of the party, and the second one is a front channel interaction where there is a redirect to a defined, it's called the claims interaction endpoint at the AS, which eventually allows for the requesting party to engage in that potentially a very complex flow.
Yeah, we'll walk through a couple of examples of those in a second.
Yeah, precisely. So next slide, please.
All right, so the UMA grant is, it's got some moving parts, but ultimately, if there is the requesting side has given the authorization server what it needs to say, well, you're going to succeed. There's this authorization assessment process that's internal to the AS, but there's some requirements on how it performs that. We'll just call that some set math. I'll describe that in a sec. Then it goes through a happy flow that should look familiar from other OAuth grants. So I'm gonna leave aside some of this, the lower bubble there. There's some sort of standard access token behavior and a little bit of behavior that's unfamiliar. We're not gonna spend time on the persisted claims token today. We can just maybe discuss that in the fullness of time. But the reason why we have that authorization assessment and set math stuff is to account for the fact that there's policy conditions that the resource owner can set up. So let's talk about that. Next slide, please. So authorization assessment, the reason why there are those constraints is that the resource owner gets to say, if you think about like UMA sort of standardizing a little bit of what goes on if there's like a Google Docs share button or an access approval loop, the resource owner has a chance to impose some wishes on the process. And so if Alice gets to impose some wishes and then Bob has to prove he's him or prove that he meets some criteria, well, some of that has to be taken into account. So this is a diagram showing how that has to be taken into account somewhat by the authorization server. So first of all, since the client starts out 100% untrusted and the requesting party starts out 100% untrusted and they never become 100% trusted, we say that the client had to pre-register scopes for whatever that means with the AS in order for a scope request at the AS to have some effect. So that has to be some union of pre-registered scopes and just-in-time requested scopes for those to be considered. Now, any permissions that are represented in the permission ticket can add to the total requested scopes for them to be considered. So you can see there's the math. And then ultimately, if what ends up in these requested scopes is just partially satisfying what somebody asked for, then the AS can say, look, for business rule reasons, I can error this out or I can grant what ends up being partial. So those are some of the guardrails that we put in. If no questions, we'll move on. Okay, now we're going to give you some sample flows. And I know this may be an eye chart, but of course you guys have this available. We have 2 sample flows, and these are sort of the most popularly implemented. This is, we call this pushed claims. And I'm going to call this, it sort of looks like an assertion grant pattern because it means that the requesting side provides a token packaged up already that Bob doesn't have to, the requesting party doesn't have to experience typing in something, having a live interaction with. It means the client is in possession of some sort of token it can push along, kind of like single sign-on or something. So what you're seeing is, by the way, at the top, I've got a little dotted line around basically authorization server and a bunch of endpoints that all represent the authorization server. So not to confuse anybody, but that's what you're seeing there. And we'll see that in the next slide as well. So this is the most popular flow through the grant sequence so far among the options. All the implementers that we know of have implemented the pushed claim option. So this starts with the back channel option and just stays there. It basically just uses the token endpoint. It illustrates kind of a narrow ecosystem in that the AS is also the IDP that Bob uses. So the client lets the requesting party, Bob, log in to this AS that is the IDP, and then it hangs on to the resulting ID token. It pushes that ID token to the AS that is the IDP silently to prove that Bob is Bob when required, because Alice's policy demands that. So it's kind of very approximately like IDP-initiated single sign-on or something. So there's kind of this narrow ecosystem that agreed that that's what was needed. Or it's kind of like Google Docs when Bob is already logged in because Alice's policy said, share this document with Bob. If no questions, then next slide, please.
Okay, and as you've mentioned, the previous one was more of a more popular flow. This one is the less popular one, and this one involves the actual front channel interaction of the requesting party at the AS. So as you can see, there is a front channel redirect of a requesting party to the claims interaction endpoint at the AS. So this is the claims at AS kind of dotted line. It does allow between the arrow 2 and arrow 3 to have a very complex, I would say, interaction between the AS and the requesting party. So let's say that the AS can even act as a relying party to a different IDP, can collect various attributes about the individual from some kind of distributed sources, and based on that can execute the authorization assessment. After that, it redirects the requesting party back to the client. So it redirects it back to what is called the claims redirect URI. And that can finish the interaction. Once the client has the new permission ticket, it can again request the requesting party token. So it does that through the token endpoint at the AS. Again, once the RPT is issued to the client, and the client can then start interacting with the resource server by using the newly issued RPT. Okay, next slide, please.
One quick comment about that last one. Just wanted to say a comment that we've heard, at least from one or two implementers, is that claims interaction, it kind of functions like an authorization endpoint, only a little bit more flexible, because you don't have to start with it. You could go to the token endpoint first. You could go to the claims interaction first. You can sort of mix them up. So it functions a little bit. That's why we call it the authorization endpoint.
Yeah, I think it's important that these two can kind of coexist in the same flow, right? So some claims can be kind of collected in the push mode, I would say, and some for the claims interaction mode.
Looks like Tony's been on.
Tony Nadlin. Some questions. In reading the spec, it was hard to figure out, the dynamic claims gathering actually works. It looks like there was some undocumented stuff going on there as far as how the protocol to actually do the claims gathering. And the other thing is, I looked at it and it looked like resource sharing could be done by some of the token exchange work that's been done in here. And have you guys looked at that, integrating the token exchange work in this stuff? And then I still am curious of how this fits with current authorization servers, because they have a different pattern today. And I'm a little bit concerned over, changing that, or do you believe that this is just for users that have to go through the UMA process for resource registrations and stuff? So, you're proposing this as a standalone document, as I understood, the grant, right?
So I think I think you're talking about the act as semantic.
Yeah.
The challenge is that it isn't always act as. It's allowing somebody to act on behalf of themselves.
Both of them have, both token exchange has both of those semantics. So.
It's we couldn't figure out how to get an individual to actually delegate access, and that's the one thing I've seen in all the other proposals, is how to fully get an individual or anybody else responsible, basically as a resource owner. So there's actually business model work as well, how you can get a data subject to have somebody else. I have a privacy section in here as well that we can talk about.
Yeah, I have some privacy questions too.
Yeah, so there's some folks who are wanting this for privacy purposes, basically, and they have not found something that actually packages it up for privacy purposes. So I have looked at it. We have not found anything that actually meets all of the needs packaged up, and that is part of the challenge. So we could do a comparison exercise, but the challenge has been to find something that actually solves a business use case end to end. And this has met the needs of a whole bunch of customers. And maybe some other folks in the room can speak up as well for their purposes. I'm not sure if they have dealt with that question.
So who do you see using this particular set of specification? At least the first specification.
We can go back to slide 12 if you want to. The typical use cases: health, financial, IoT,
No, I mean,
enterprise.
Do you see it for just the people that want to register their resources? I mean, this is not necessarily how things work today. So I'm curious of how you see people changing to use this.
I'm talking about customers, actual customers. So
Do they? Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how this will actually wind up getting used over the current model of the current OAuth model.
well, the problem is that you'd have to build a lot of stuff, I believe, on token exchange, which is a building block spec, to get it to actually solve this use case end to end. That is what people have been discovering. I don't know anybody who's actually used token exchange to solve share button and access approval loops for Alice to Bob sharing in an interoperable fashion.
Okay, I'll take it to the list then. Thanks.
Okay.
Right. Any questions, or should we go to the next slide? Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah.
All right. So some observations on the UMA clients, and I don't know if Pedro is in the room, but if he is, then I believe some of those are his comments. But in case of the UMA clients, what we realize is that the clients themselves, they can be a little bit dumber than in the OAuth case, right? So they don't have to necessarily understand all the scopes, etc. They can start making requests to. They can make a request to a resource server, obtain the permission ticket, and kind of follow the interaction based on that permission ticket without understanding what scopes are associated there. So we kind of externalize this entire, I would say, entitlement logic, because the second aspect is that also I would say the error flows are really kind of well defined in the spec. So the clients can, based on whatever they receive, they can act. They can understand that they have to either redirect the user, push the claims, etc., etc. So it's in short, they can be kind of lightweight. I think we're short on time, so let's skip to the next slide, please.
Yeah, you have about 13 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we have 30 minutes left, or?
Yes.
Oh, okay. We may have time. I would say let's go quickly through this section, though.
Okay, so let's next slide, please.
1-3, I think.
13. Okay. Yeah, I would like to have at least 5 minutes plus for discussion on that last couple of slides, Maciej. So.
Of course. So basic flows in the UMA. Okay, can we go back? Oh, sorry, this slide is fine. Yeah. So firstly, in the federated authorization, so what we have is that the AS presents a standard, what we call a protection API for resource servers, and there are three main functions of the protection API. The first one is for resource registration. The second one is for permission registration. And the third one is for token introspection. And there are respective endpoints for that, called the resource registration endpoint, the permission endpoint, and the enhanced token introspection endpoint. For the resource server to interact with the protection API, as we mentioned, it has to have a PAT, which is a plain OAuth a token with the UMA protection scope associated, and it's typically it's issued to the resource server with the resource owner in place, unless it's a kind of like an enterprise resource owner. So then a different flow happens. If we can go to the next slide.
So if I could jump in a comment from Jabber.
Sure.
Sorry.
Uh-oh.
Justin says, in my view, UMA clients aren't dumber than OAuth clients so much as they are dumb in a different way.
Okay.
Yes.
Agree.
Yes. A couple of the new artifacts that we are not going to have time to discuss. The PCT, assuming that an AS produces them, that's something that a client has to manage.
Right. So next slide, please. Right. So first, the first endpoint, as I mentioned, was the resource registration endpoint. So it's a very standard. Sorry, not a standard. It's a RESTful endpoint, kind of like a CRUD type endpoint that allows the resource server to start managing resources for protection. So it allows to create the resource description. It allows to list the available, the registered resource descriptions. To update the descriptions, delete, etc., etc. Again, all the requests have to have a path associated. Next slide, please. The resources and the scopes that get registered are so two things. On the resources are just descriptions that get registered on the AS, right? So the AS pretty much does not learn what the resource is. The information that gets registered is something that should allow the resource owner to manage a policy. So there are a number of things like a description, an icon, a type, etc. And importantly, the scopes are resource specific. So we can see that on the example, we have a RS1 and RS2, and they have a different set of scopes.
Yeah, they might share some scopes that end up being identical, which could make a difference in authorization assessment, but they might have different scopes, which is something maybe we're not normally
Yes, and some of the scopes, they can be URIs, which can be resolvable, which also means that we can, let's say, create kind of like a set of standard scopes which can be reused across different resource protected resources. Next slide, please.
So guys, try to leave 5 minutes at the end for just some discussion around this, okay?
Of course. The permission endpoint, very simple. Once the client executes a request to a resource server, the resource server, what it does is that it registers a permission at the authorization server. It uses the permission endpoint for that purpose. You can see an example of a request at the bottom, which references a particular resource and the scopes which should be kind of added to that permission. To that permission ticket. Importantly, the resource server can register like a single resource or a set of resources that it thinks should be linked with the permission ticket. Next slide, please. And the token introspection. So the token introspection follows the Oauth one with one important change. So it does not return the scope value. Instead, it has the permissions value, and that's because we have this kind of layered structure. So we have a resource and associated scopes for that resource. Next slide, please. And right, okay, and some observations. If you want to take it.
Yeah, let me maybe sort of take this, and we can sort of go to the end right after this. I just wanted to point out that we've been watching with interest what ACE has been doing, also watching the resource indicators conversation. And the RS offline use case is of interest to us, given a lot of IoT use cases that UMA seems to have. So I'll just sort of let that sit there in case there's people interested to go down that path. Next, please. And we can skip all these next slides and I think go to slide 39 and we can go to the conclusion. And if you don't mind, I can just take these. This is just a kind of quick summary we tried to put together based on stuff that we've been hearing from all the folks who have been implementing and using UMA. So I'm just going to sort of let that be there as a sort of a leave behind. I suppose if we can take Justin's point about the really dumb point. Again, that's a quote, so I put it in quotes on the client side. But there's benefits that we've been hearing on the RS side about externalizing authorization. That's feedback that we gathered in putting this together. Standardizing management of protected resources. Again, feedback gathered. Benefits to the resource owner around controlling data sharing. That's a privacy benefit that we've been hearing from those who want to, those who are in the position of deploying this for consumers. Benefits to an AS and to the requesting party as well around things like revoking access meaningfully. When you're actually sharing with an autonomous third party, that becomes really different than when you're sort of sharing it with yourself using a client. And so I'll just go to the last slide so that we can hopefully have a little bit of discussion here. And to Tony's point, if there's ways to incorporate specs that already exist, that's, it's part of the point of sedimenting things down and part of the point of, leveraging more OAuth. That's actually how UMA 2 happened. It was to leverage OAuth 2 more fully because UMA 1 was based on OAuth 1, but apparently not enough, actually. And then OAuth 2 happened, and we were able to sort of leverage OAuth 2 more fully, and that's how we have a formal extension grant, for example. So, we're trying to solve real use cases that people seem to have, and sedimenting further into the ecosystem is part of our goal because there's seems like there's pretty high demand right now for the flows, the use cases that we've described. We're trying to figure out a way to leverage the expertise of this group and so on. So here you can see the proposal on the screen. So figure out how to open it up in the time remaining.
Okay, cool. So let me get a sense of who has had a chance to look at those documents. And thanks for submitting them. It's please raise your hand if you had a chance to look at them. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have a few, 5, 6. Yeah. So we have a bunch of folks who actually looked at the documents. So clearly, this is currently another one on Java. Clearly, this is something that would require rechartering because it's obviously not in our charter today. But we both are interested to hear on what you guys think in terms of sort of adoption for this group, which is what Eve and Marche are asking for in this specific case. John.
John Bradley. Hi, Eve. Hi, Marche. So that's, I guess my question is exactly what are you asking for? Is this proposal that the technical specification work moves to the OAuth work group and the UMA working group at Kantara winds down? Or that two things happen in parallel? You're probably well aware that once something becomes an IETF spec, the working group feels obliged to make breaking changes and put its own stamp on it. So, I mean, it's unlikely that the working group would publish a fully compatible spec with what Kantara has already published.
So yeah, I mean, we're aware that, you know, a work item is a work item. We are also, you know, we're also aware that if it's taken up as a work item, that can lead to greater adoption. And we wanted to make sure that this community, this wider community, aware that there's quite a few implementers who can advise and contribute to the process around existing implementations and deployments, because it's a sign of, I hope, the value of, you know, the nature of the use cases and the nature of adoption to date. And so that could inform how the work items could proceed if there's interest. To your question about what would happen to the existing work group in Kantara, there's actually existing work, as I point out on the slide, that would probably continue at least for a time. Number one, interop processes for the current specs, which are Kantara recommendations. We're planning to have an interop results report out effectively at Identiverse for one. Mm-hmm. And there's work that I didn't report on right here for time's sake, but work that we call business model work. And, you know, we can just treat it as a leave behind that are in the slides here. I've presented on it previously over the last year plus. That would probably continue as, you know, as long as the specs are stable enough. Or, you know, would continue in some form to whatever state the specs are in. You know, breaking changes would be unfortunate. We'd probably want to keep them to a minimum, given that we've got a whole bunch of folks who have implemented and, you know, deployed. And so hopefully there'd be a balance and a consideration for that.
Okay, I'm got to cut the line after Roman. Go ahead.
Yep.
Okay.
So Ben wanted to jump in saying, sometimes we publish an existing technology unchanged, interoperable in the IETF stream as an informational document with the understanding that this effectuates transfer of change control, and future IETF versions need not be compatible.
Right, that was where I was going to go.
But I think Eve has answered that quite clearly.
Right, but
yeah, it's a contribution to the working group, and we
So
don't know yet what changes will be made.
It wouldn't be published as a working group document unchanged. It would be published as an individual submission.
It would be treated like any other document that we have, and we never know what changes.
No.
What do you mean?
That wasn't that. There could be an individual submission from Kantara to the IETF document stream, which would enable a publication of a draft.
I understand,
unchanged, but not as a working group document. Then there would be a UMA 3.
I understand, but that's not what.
Is that what you're asking for, or
no? That's what she just said.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, what's of most interest, I think, is what would be of mutual interest to do to strengthen it and Oauth together. There's like various streams and you know, maybe ACE.
Yeah, we'll clarify that on the list, but that was I understand.
Tony Hadlin. You want to jump in? Okay. Yeah, I'm still confused over what's being asked for here.
Okay,
I do have some.
Maybe are you planning to ask some detailed questions about the specification?
Yeah.
We don't have time for that.
I mean, that's what this was supposed to be for, right?
No. We
I mean, it does have.
Sure, but. Okay.
Just finish your thought.
No. Because we ran out of time. But
I know.
maybe we clarify this high-level point. And Eve, so the question that was surrounding here was like, in the contributions that you are making with these documents, do you expect them to be published as RCs as they are today, like as you have submitted them, or are they supposed to be input to the working group with most likely there will be changes to the specification, as we have seen all our specifications change. Which one of those two are you aiming for?
The latter, recognizing there would probably be changes, we'd hope that input from folks who have existing implementations and deployments would be taken into consideration.
That was clear.
It's much more interesting to do.
Okay. Yeah.
Then off of Jabber, Brian Campbell is asking, is this going to be contributed to ACE2 then?
We had not talked about it or considered it. I would have thought that'd be confusing, but constrained or IoT use cases are definitely something we had been striving for in our work over the last few years. I don't know how it would work to contribute them to two groups with the same aim that I just expressed. So maybe somebody could tell me that.
No, Roman as the AD hat. Yeah, that would be confusing. Minimally, the ACE co-chairs and the ADs can get together.
Yeah. I think the most likely route in that context is like it was done by the ACE group. In other contexts, they define different transports for stuff that we defined in this working group.
Righto.
Yeah, but we would double check that. But we are going to send a mail to the list about this and continue discussion from there and see what the level of interest is. Thanks, Eve and Marce, for the presentation.
Thank you all for the opportunity and for the comments. Thanks.
Vittorio, you are next. You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Yeah, 15.
All right. Thank you. Buongiorno, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. I know you guys are tired and bored, so I will try to keep you alive for the next 14 minutes. I'm going to present on new work which occurred basically all in the last 20 days. And too long didn't read. We are trying to find an interoperable profile for access tokens that uses JWT. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So to give you just a bit of context, I'm sure that in your professional life, you have stumbled countless times in situations in which access tokens, which are shapeless, according to Oauth 2, in fact, have been implemented by particular vendors in JWT format. Now, that doesn't mean that the scenarios in which you have a no-format access token are not valid. They are, of course, perfectly valid. However, there are a very large number of scenarios in which, for vendors, it actually makes sense to use a format that can be evaluated by the resource server without calling on further. And typically, all those vendors go and use JWT as that format. And interestingly, they pretty much all try to achieve the same things. They want to validate the token. They want to get delegated authorization information. They want to get identity information, sometimes context, and so on and so forth. However, given that there is no guidance, they all do this in a slightly different way, different enough that you can't standardize on SDKs, you can't standardize on approach, and sometimes the same concept is interpreted differently. So it's a mess. Also, there are many specifications that somehow always talk about this mythical audience in the access tokens, but we never refer to it anywhere. So clearly, I believe that there is a need for some guidance there that will help unify and avoid reinventing the wheel across multiple providers. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Can I have a next slide? Thank you. Oh, wow. Your AI understands exactly when I want the next slide. It's amazing. Thank you, guys. So what have we done so far? Basically, to meet that intuition, I worked with some individual vendors, Identity Server, Okta, Microsoft, Auth0. I know I'm for Ping Identity. And I basically acquired examples of access tokens in JWT format for different scenarios like a two-legged off, three-legged off, and examined the content, put everything together, and somehow tried to extract commonalities and differences. And then out of that work, I created a very rough proposal. And then last week, I basically spent 2 hours talking with the Oauth Security Workshop audience and refined this proposal. And I have to say that that was really amazing. Let's say that the progress was really fast. Many ideas which were not particularly well advised were killed right away. Other really great ideas were contributed in it. And then on my flight back from Germany, I wrote everything in a draft. Yesterday, I changed it in your silly XML syntax, which is really, really, I felt like when I first learned that Fortran has a fixed columns, like, really? Like, what century is this? But anyway, never mind. I somehow managed to convince the uploader to accept the draft, and now the draft is out. And I've sent a mail to the list. I already got interesting feedback, and I know that others are talking about this on Twitter, on the ID Pro list and similar. So clearly, I believe there is some interest. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And even the next one. Thank you. Okay, so this spec isn't long. It shouldn't be. And it's relatively simple. It just tries to bring some fixed points in here. So here in this short presentation, I just want to give you a taste of it. But of course, I think that the discussion is best done on the spec in itself. So here there is more or less the layout that emerged from the cross-analysis of all these different access tokens. There is a bunch of claims that are typically used for establishing validity of a token. And those are all good friends that we have been known for a long time. We need to know the issuer. We need to know expiration. We really want to scope these access tokens down to an audience, and I'll have more to say about it when in a couple of slides from now. And then we have like a classic information about the issuance time or authentication time, which can occasionally come in useful, but not mandatory. We have the subject, of course, and here there is already some discussion about this, as in the first proposal that I put forth, I suggested that we make the sub mandatory even for flows in which there is no subject, but there is only the polling application. Reason being that a number of vendors do that, but not only this, that from the point of view of SDKs and tool makers, if there is some logic which deals with membership, having the ability to have one unique identifier in which you latch that kind of logic might be handy. The information is in there anyway, because like we mandate also the use of client ID. So potentially, even if we make the sub only for end user, we'd be fine. It's just a matter of like convenience and reliability of the kind of information that is in there. But anyway, that's already in the list to discuss. Then we discussed the possibility of giving some guidance on how to include identity claims in access tokens. And we know that there are privacy concerns. And so in the current draft, there is language which warns the reader that all these should be done with care. However, we know for a fact that the vendors do this. Let's say that the samples that I got contain identity information about the user. So at the very least, giving guidance of the flavor of the claims that we used, and in particular, the one that we got from the OpenID Connect profile and the introspection seem to be good starting points. Then, of course, now finally, we have a way of specifying for certain the scope, and there is some logic that I'm suggesting about how to map the incoming scopes in requests and how they would appear in the token. We also know from the various samples that we have seen that vendors use access tokens to carry other authorization information, which is not strictly related to OAuth. As in, imagine that your authorization, your resource server is facading resources that already exist regardless of a protocol, and on which you already have entitlements, roles, and potential relationship with groups. And so often you'll see those access tokens transporting also this information. Of course, we know that authorization is a Cambrian explosion, so we wouldn't probably want to get into the details of what goes inside those things. But in terms of type, I think that would benefit everyone by suggesting at least that the claim types that we select are from one agreed upon source, and the best one that we identified during the workshop last week was the scheme core, which has some good types. Tony, do you want to do this at the very end? Because it's not going to be long. As you like, as you prefer.
No, go, we'll wait.
Okay, because it's not long. Given that I have 15 minutes, I don't want to risk not to cover all the ground.
Yeah, 6 more minutes.
Yeah. 6 more minutes. Okay, I'm going to go even faster. So we started with client ID. Okay, perfect. Good. So one very important thing is that we want to make sure that people don't misinterpret the access tokens expressed in JWT as ID tokens, because that would lead to issues. So we are using strong typing, and I'm suggesting that we create a new MIME type that makes it very clear that this is an access token and should not be interpreted as an access token. Next slide. Thank you. Just to give you a flavor, this would be the smallest access token in JWT format that we can obtain. There should be no surprises in there. As you can see, there is no PII, so good step. Next, please. Okay, when we request an access token in whatever traditional way we are doing, we can get back a JWT access token, just like before. When we use resource indicators and we pass a resource, we expect that resource to be reflected in the audience, in line with what resource indicators says. And we discussed the possibility of scope confusion. Unfortunately, in my opinion, resource indicator allows using multiple audiences. And that is a problem, because when you have a list of scopes, unless you do scope stuffing, you might get into scope confusion, in which you don't know what scope is relevant for what resource. So for the sake of simplicity and effectiveness, in here, the suggestion is to restrict a resource only to single resources, as opposed to list of resources. And that should prevent scope confusion. For the cases in which a resource is not provided at request time, the authorization server is supposed to have some resource string that will be used in the audience. This can be a default value extracted from the context, or it can be extracted from the scopes. If a scope somehow entail one particular resource, the authorization server should be able to pull this out. Of course, these open up the possibility of scopes giving contrasting resources, and so that should return some kind of error. Next, please. Validation isn't going to be surprising for anyone. The idea is if we are using asymmetric crypto, we can publish of the validation coordinates through the authorization server metadata or the OpenID Connect discovery, which is what almost every vendor does already today. The checks are substantially, we needed to check that the type is AT plus JWS, and then all the other checks, you can see the spec, but they are largely what you would expect from the claim type that they are being passed. Open-ended is whether we should explicitly say that the authorization server should look and act on the scopes, because that's something that we don't do elsewhere. Next, please. I already made these security considerations, so next. And for privacy here, we just want to be extra certain that we remind the readers of a spec that now the client will be able to see inside the token, even if they are not supposed to look. This remains opaque for clients. But in practice, someone might see the content, and so if the content is not the user seeing his or her own information, we should take measures to protect it. And then for what concerns disclosing this content to the resource server, like identities and similar, we have to make sure that we have everything by the book, as in if we had to ask for consent, we got it. If we had to have users agree on some term of use, we should do it. But we should be careful that we share information only to parties that are expected to get it. Next, please. Okay, so next steps to me are are you guys interested in adopting this puppy? One. Two, of course, this one is a very first draft. I feel pretty good about this because we had extensive high bandwidth conversation last week. But of course, this, I'm sure we'll have a lot of things to iron out. So needs to be discussed. And then I have a number of open issues, but I think it might be premature to go through this list. And so I'd rather stop here and open it up for questions.
Cool. Thanks, Vittorio. It's probably, so let me, so if you, okay. It's probably too early to ask whether you guys actually have reviewed it, given that you just submitted it. But some of you have been at the workshop last week, and so let me ask on who has read the document or who knows about the content. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Who has read the document? 1, 2. Well, there are 2 people who have already read it. Yeah. Who? But let me. Yeah. In more general question is, who is in favor of having a document in the OAuth working group that describes a profile of access tokens? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Who objects to that idea of having such a profile?
I don't object, but I think there are some issues about this draft.
No. That's you know, like. No. You as you know, like, I'm not going to ask now for adoption because that would be a little bit too fast. But I would like to get a sense of the room whether there's interest in doing anything like this at all, regardless of what exactly the recommendations are that we will come out at the end of the tunnel. So I guess what we will do is drop a mail to the list and encourage people to read the document and provide some comments, and then we'll obviously have to talk to the ADs to find out, or AD, to find out whether that fits in the scope of the group, or rechartering or milestone editions are needed. Definitely milestone editions. Rechartering probably not, but a milestone edition, we'll need to figure this out. But yeah, I think that's what we should do. Vittoria, what do you think?
You're the boss.
That's the first time someone says that to me in this group, you know. Okay, cool. Perfect. Thanks, Vittoria. Thank you all for the input so far. And we have the next session on Thursday where we discuss more and yeah, see where we go. Thank you, guys.